Hello, and welcome to Storytelling Animals, a Green New Books podcast of climate, ecology, and animal justice. I'm your host, Staten Martindale, and today my guest is Jeff Sebo, who's the director of the Animal Studies Master's Program at New York University and the author of the brand new book, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves: Why Animals Matter for Pandemics, Climate Change, and Other Catastrophes. I think you can guess from the title what a lot of our conversation will be about. And the first half of this interview, much like the first half of the book, does focus on the connections between industries that exploit non-human animals, such as factory farming or deforestation, also are connected to pandemics and climate change, which affect both human and non-human animals. But then in the second half, we also get into some of the philosophical weeds of this, such as which animals count and how much, how should we think about human or non-human populations that aren't born yet, what are our ethical obligations to them, and some of the stuff that's most exciting to me, how could our political and legal processes better include other species? So we go through a lot here, and there's even more in the book, so if you enjoy the interview, I encourage you to check that out. I'll also say that our March 29th book club for Patreon subscribers is on a book called Barn 8 by Deb Olin Unferth, which is a novel about a couple people who decide they want to try to rescue some factory farm chickens. So if you're interested in some of the animal rights issues discussed in this interview, I hope you will consider subscribing on Patreon if you haven't already, and joining us for that March 29th book club. Still plenty of time to pick up a copy and read the book. All right, here we go. Hi, I'm here with Jeff Sebo, author of Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves. Jeff, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So, yeah, like I said, the name of the book is Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves: Why Animals Matter for Pandemics, Climate Change, and Other Catastrophes. Before we dig into some of the details of this book, I was hoping you could just tell us big picture what you're trying to do with the project and what led you to write it.
Yeah, so this book is about how animals matter for global health and environmental issues like pandemics and climate change, and how global health and environmental issues like pandemics and climate change matter for animals. So I want to focus on both halves of that equation. And so the story that I tell in the book is a story about how our use of animals contributes to these global health and environmental threats, and how these global health and environmental threats then impact animals all over again. So animals are caught up in these global systems, both as causes through no faults of their own and as victims. In factory farming and deforestation and the wildlife trade, we treat them in ways that increase the risk of pandemics and climate change, outbreaks, fires, and floods. And then when outbreaks and fires and floods happen, they harm animals directly and indirectly. Animals are vulnerable to these threats and also vulnerable to increased violence and neglect from humans when these threats occur. And so I try to tell that story in the book, and then argue for including animals in global health and environmental advocacy and policy by reducing our use of them as part of our pandemic and climate change mitigation efforts, and increasing our support for them as part of our pandemic and climate change adaptation efforts. And I also present some policy proposals that I think can help us advance these goals in the short term. And I also discuss some of the more complicated political and philosophical and scientific questions that we need to answer in order to make more progress on these issues in the long run.
Mm-hmm. So you had a previous book on food, animals, and the environment, and also contributed to a book on chimpanzee rights.
Mm-hmm.
What led you to pandemics and climate change?
Well, I think that these are obviously interesting and important topics, and now unfortunately timely topics. They were a little bit less timely when I started working on the book in 2017, but of course, starting around 2020, as we know, COVID-19 occurred, and around that same time, the Australia bushfires were occurring, and then later other floods and fires and signs of climate change. So these are important and now increasingly timely and urgent issues. And I was interested in connecting animals with those issues because I think animal welfare is one of the most important and neglected topics we can possibly be working on. But then also some of these global catastrophic threats, like human-caused pandemics and climate change, are also among the most important and neglected issues we can be working on. And the connections between these issues are especially, I think, important and neglected. And so I really wanted to shine a light on that and argue for integrating these discussions so that we can understand how animals fit in to these broader issues that we need to be working on, so that we can be motivated to think about animals when working on these issues and think about these issues when working in support of animals, but also do it with our eyes open and recognize how complicated these problems are and how many different issues we need to think about in order to do this work well.
Mm-hmm. You say in the preface or introduction that you'd already written about 2 drafts before 2020 and when the coronavirus pandemic took off. Pandemics are a big part of the book. Were they as big a part before that happened? How much rewriting did you have to do, or did it actually fit what you were trying to do?
Yeah, it was a part of what I was trying to do all along. The book was all along the way about why animals matter for these global health and environmental threats. And these health and environmental threats are themselves related to each other. Pandemics and climate change can be mutually reinforcing problems. And animal agriculture and deforestation and the wildlife trade all contribute in various ways to pandemics, and animal agriculture and deforestation both contribute in various ways to climate change. And so the connections between pandemics and climate change, especially with animals and our use of animals at the center of both, that was always part of the story. But of course, this was before COVID-19. It was a long time since we had a proper global pandemic. And so when I was writing the first 2 drafts, it was really warning us about what could happen if we keep treating animals this way and we keep treating the planet this way. And now the book is still sending that same message, but we have a new updated cautionary tale that we can point to show the kind of problem that can arise if we keep treating animals and the planet this way. So when I rewrote the book for a 3rd time during COVID-19 in 2020, the frameworks were the same and the main information and arguments were all the same. But obviously the case studies were different, and COVID-19 and the Australian bushfires and other recent case studies, those were of course much more prominent in the final draft of the book. And I maybe wrote it with a little bit of a different energy or spirit than I might have written it if it was fully foreseeing and trying to warn people about some kind of future threat, as opposed to writing it while living through a present threat.
Yeah, a hypothetical future threat feels different than one that we are unfortunately still living with.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess I think most listeners of this podcast will be agreeing that climate change and environmental issues are an under-addressed threat right now. I think probably most people in the world are agreeing now that maybe we haven't adequately prepared for pandemics. I think the animal welfare piece is one that I feel strongly about and that we've touched on in some previous episodes here, but is maybe not as widely held to be, I think you just called it one of the most neglected and important issues out there. So what is kind of the brief the brief case for we should really be thinking and caring more about other animals?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that. I think it can be really easy for people to focus on one half of the equation that I mentioned earlier, the part where our use of animals contributes to health and environmental threats like pandemics and climate change, but then ignore the other half of the equation where our use of animals also harms and kills trillions of animals per year directly, and then many more animals per year indirectly via these global human-caused changes like deforestation, development, agriculture, transportation, and increasingly outbreaks, fires, and floods, and so on. And so the reason animal welfare matters, I mean, this is now an old argument that many people have made in different ways within different frameworks, but many non-human animals are sentient beings. They have the capacity for consciousness and emotionality and a sense of self and bonds of care and interdependence. And more concretely, they have the capacity to experience pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering. And if you are sentient, that is enough for you to morally matter for your own sake. If you can feel pleasure and pain and happiness and suffering, then it matters to you how we treat you. It matters to you what happens to you. And we have a responsibility to consider your experiences and your preferences and your interests when making decisions about how to treat you. And one really important development in philosophy of mind and cognitive science over the past 50 years or so is not only have we realized that sentient beings have moral status, but we have also realized that many more animals are sentient beings than we previously appreciated. And so when you combine those two ideas, that sentience is enough to matter, and that huge numbers of animals are both sentient and affected by our activity, then it shows how much we really ought to be considering animal welfare when making decisions that affect animals, which increasingly many of our decisions do.
Yeah, I want to maybe get into later which animals have been shown to be most likely sentient, some of which are surprising. But first, maybe let's just sort of continue making the case laid out in the title. With pandemics, you said there's two sides of the coin, which is the industries that are often driving pandemics and disease outbreaks, such as industrial animal agriculture, deforestation, the wildlife trade. These are also industries that directly harm non-human animals. The effects of these industries harm them. The effects of these industries harm us. With pandemics, more specifically, why do animals in these industries matter for pandemics?
Sure. So factory farming and deforestation matter in ways that are linked. So factory farming matters both because this is an industry that breeds and raises very many non-human animals, and it breeds these animals to grow as big as possible, as fast as possible, and these animals have weakened immune systems and are susceptible to disease, and then kept in cramped and toxic conditions in close proximity to each other. And this is an ideal place for diseases to develop and spread across farmed animal populations. And then we add to that huge quantities of antibiotics and other antimicrobials, both to stimulate growth and to suppress the spread of disease. And so when you combine huge numbers of sick animals with weakened immune systems kept in close proximity to each other with high quantities of antibiotics and antimicrobials, that makes factory farms ideal breeding grounds for novel antibiotic or antimicrobial resistant pathogens like COVID-19. And then deforestation increases the risk of pandemics, both because wild animals already carry huge numbers of viruses that have the potential to spread to humans. And when we cut down forests, we increase interactions between humans and wild animals. And so we increase the risk that viruses can spread from wild animals to humans. And we can also reduce forested biodiversity, which can sometimes function as a buffer against the spread of zoonotic diseases across wild animal populations. So with deforestation, when we cut down these trees, we both make it more likely that diseases will spread among animals and make it more likely that diseases will spread to humans. And these are linked points because factory farming, industrial animal agriculture is also a leading driver of deforestation. So when we support factory farming, not only do we support the breeding and raising of all these animals and application of antibiotics and antimicrobials to them, and the increased risk of pandemics through those mechanisms, but then we also indirectly support increased deforestation and the spread of diseases through that mechanism. So these are all linked ways of increasing the risk of outbreaks and epidemics and pandemics. And then, of course, the wildlife trade is this whole other way of increasing the risk of pandemics, because we take animals from the wild or we breed them in captivity. And that, of course, in and of itself increases interactions between humans and wild animals. And then often we keep these animals in confinement, again, in conditions where they can easily get sick and spread diseases to each other and then spread diseases to humans. One of the stories, of course, about how COVID-19 might have emerged is through a live market in Wuhan, China, where an animal might have spread a virus to a human. Now, that is only one story about how COVID-19 might have emerged, and we might not ever know for sure how COVID-19 emerged. But whether or not this particular pandemic emerged that way, what we know is that a pandemic can emerge in any of these ways that I have discussed, and that is what is important for our thinking about what to do moving forward.
Yeah, and I think what we've also learned is that pandemics can not only emerge in these situations, but also get worse through these situations.
Yes, exactly.
With,
right.
I think there were a few articles, and you talk about in your book the issue of minks in particular with COVID-19, where when we think factory farming, we're often thinking animals raised for meat, but animals raised for clothes are also kept in tightly packed, inhumane conditions. Mink fur is popular, and this minks the particularities of their immune systems have proved to be very susceptible to COVID-19 and to potentially spreading variants or what have you.
Yes, that is absolutely right. Yeah, the Mink pandemic in 2020 was a really sad case. So this was a situation where basically, as you say, we feel pretty confident that COVID-19 didn't emerge from mink farms, but once it emerged, all of these places where we keep animals in confinement, like various types of animal farms, became places where COVID-19 could spread to animals and then spread among animals and then potentially develop mutations, and then we could have new variants on our hands. And so when COVID-19 started to spread all around the world, we knew, or at least we should have known, that it was only a matter of time before it would start to infect farmed minks who, like you said, are already vulnerable to these sorts of respiratory diseases and are made especially vulnerable when kept in conditions like we keep them in these fur farms. And so what happened? Well, of course, the same thing that happened in all sorts of other animal farms all around the world. We decided to protect ourselves from the possibility of these novel variants by culling, which is our euphemistic way of saying killing, all of the minks we were keeping in captivity. And so they were just a really sort of unfortunately good example of the many types of issues that can arise here, because they illustrated at one and the same time the ways in which our use of animals can contribute to these threats, and then the ways in which these threats can harm animals, not only because they make them vulnerable to the direct harms like respiratory diseases, but also because they make them vulnerable to indirect harms like increased violence from humans who would rather kill them all at the same time than accept any kind of increased risk of new variants or any increased cost or burden associated with caring for animals who need to be protected from these diseases. So the minks were vulnerable in all sorts of ways, and for that reason were unfortunately a very good example to focus on in order to illustrate how all these problems come together.
And in moving forward dealing with pandemics, you highlight something called One Health as a paradigm for public health, and highlight sort of some of the strengths of One Health and maybe where it could be improved with regard to animals. So could you just tell us what that is?
Yeah, so One Health is this really interesting relatively new framework that governments have been using in order to grapple with health threats. And basically the idea is that human and non-human and environmental health are linked. And so our efforts to study and improve human and non-human and environmental health should also be linked. In particular, the more we learn about non-human and environmental health, the more we can learn about human health as a result. And the more we improve non-human and environmental health, the more we can improve human health as a result. So One Health, the One Health health policy framework, is really an invitation to pay more attention to and do more in service of non-human and environmental health so that we can reap the benefits as humans. And I think this is great as far as it goes. It really is true that human and non-human and environmental health are linked in the ways you and I have now been discussing, and in many other ways as well. And we should be tracking those connections and considering them when thinking about how to improve human health. But what are the limitations? I think that there are a few main limitations. One is that even insofar as our goal is to promote human health, we are not doing that enough. For example, factory farming and deforestation in the wildlife trade, those pose significant threats for human health, but we are currently, in most respects, acting like we can deal with that through minor incremental reforms that leave the status quo regarding our use of animals in place. But there is no way that we can maintain these systems, particularly factory farming and deforestation, no way that we can maintain these systems and properly protect and promote human health. The only way to properly protect and promote human health is by ending these systems and replacing them with humane and healthful and sustainable plant-based alternatives that would also require much less land use. So one shortcoming of One Health is that we're actually not doing enough, even insofar as our goal is to promote human health. Another shortcoming is that we are, for the most part, focusing on non-human health only instrumentally, only as a means to the end of promoting human health, rather than regarding non-human health as good for the sake of the animals too. And for that reason, when we see opportunities to improve non-human health that also improve human health, then we go for it. But if we see opportunities to promote non-human health that might not have any kinds of direct effects on human health, then we might not go for it, because we only see it as a means to an end. We need to see it as an end in itself. We need to care about human health for its own sake and non-human health for its own sake. And then the final problem is that in the human case, we intuitively, naturally understand that health is only part of the picture. We also need to think about welfare, and we also need to think about rights and justice, right? And health is not the only good that we are promoting here. We need to promote our health as a means to promoting our welfare, our well-being, and then we need to respect each other's rights in the process of improving our health and welfare and well-being. But in the case of other animals, all of that broader context slips away. And not only do we not care about their health for their own sakes, but we don't really think about their welfare or their well-being or their rights as individual animals or justice frameworks as they apply to our relationships with other animals. And so One Health could be improved by basically making all of those changes, really, really strengthening the policies meant to protect human health by really working to end factory farming and deforestation and the wildlife trade and replace them with alternatives, and then caring about non-human health for the sake of non-humans and making sure that we keep animal welfare and rights and justice in the picture too.
Mm-hmm. And I think people are maybe a little more familiar with how factory farming and deforestation relate to climate change and other environmental issues than they are with pandemics. But I would like you to sort of spell out that case as well.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So once again, factory farming and deforestation are linked, right? So when we promote factory farming, not only do we contribute to climate change in all of the ways that factory farming does, but then we also contribute to climate change in the ways that deforestation does. And once again, they both contribute to climate change, just like they both contribute to pandemics. So in the case of climate change, factory farming, industrial animal agriculture contributes to climate change. One, by bringing into existence all of these animals who emit greenhouse gases, particularly methane and nitrous oxide, and dairy and beef agriculture is especially bad for methane, of course. And so on one estimate, industrial animal agriculture contributes about 9% of global carbon emissions, 37% of global methane emissions, and 65% of global nitrous oxide emissions, which is especially important when you consider the fact that methane traps heat about 22 times as effectively, I think, as carbon dioxide does, and nitrous oxide traps heat about 296 times as effectively as carbon dioxide does. And so that all adds up to an estimated 14.5% of global human-caused greenhouse gas emissions attributable to this industry. And part of that is by bringing into existence a bunch of animals who emit greenhouse gases, and then of course farming them through practices that also emit greenhouse gases. But another part of it is needing to clear a bunch of land in order to create space both for animals to graze and be kept, and to grow the crops that you need to feed the animals. And so animal agriculture, and particularly beef and dairy agriculture, require much more land use than plant agriculture does. Because with plant agriculture, you grow some plants and you feed them to humans. With animal agriculture, you have to clear space to put the animals, then clear space to grow a bunch more plants because you lose energy in the conversion, then feed the plants to the animals, and then kill the animals and feed them to humans. Way more land use required. Mm-hmm. And when you use that land, just like you contribute to pandemics all over again, you also contribute to climate change all over again, because forests and trees and forests are one of the best ways that we currently have to capture and store carbon dioxide in the ground. And so when you cut down a bunch of trees to create space for animals and for crops to feed to the animals, then you release a bunch of carbon dioxide currently being stored in the ground into the atmosphere, and you diminish the planet's ability to capture and store carbon dioxide in the future. And this is why when we think about the climate effects or the environmental effects of our practices, we have to think about these effects holistically, because part of the story is what happens on the farms, but part of the story is all of these other indirect effects like land use change that happen prior to creating the farms, and that has to be folded into our estimates as well.
Mm-hmm. And then when the climate starts warming and there are more natural disasters, then the animals have to migrate to find more suitable habitat, except we've already cut down all the trees or destroyed all the habitat, so they don't have corridors to migrate through, and they're doing it. So it's like you said, it's sort of a vicious cycle of we contribute to climate change to pave more ways to contribute to climate change that make the effects of climate change worse.
Yes, exactly, right. And this is why I think it helps to think about pandemics and climate change in the same conversation, because not only are the stories about how our use of animals contributes to these threats similar in some ways, but also then the stories about how these threats impact animals are similar in some ways. So in the case of pandemics, we mentioned with the minks that part of how pandemics impact minks is by exposing them to these direct threats like outbreaks, but then part of how they affect minks is by exposing them to all these indirect effects or amplifying ordinary threats that they would experience anyway, like human violence and neglect. And the same is true of climate change. When our use of animals contributes to climate change, and then climate change, melts ice caps and floods coastal areas and increases temperatures and increases the frequency and intensity of extreme weather events like floods and fires and causes mass migration and all of that, that impacts wild animals directly. They get caught up in fires and floods, as we have seen, unfortunately. But then it also impacts them indirectly, because when they migrate to new areas, what happens? We call them invasive species and we kill them. Or they might be subject to predation from other animals, or hunger or thirst or illness or injury, or all sorts of other natural threats that are now amplified. So that is another sense in which we have to think about these issues really holistically and systematically if we want to account for all of the ways in which our activities are harming or threatening other animals. We can't only think about the ways in which we directly kill them, and we can't even only think about the ways in which human-caused fires and floods kill them. We also have to think about the ways in which human-caused fires and floods drive them into new territories and then subject them to new ordinary threats. And we have to be willing to accept some amount of responsibility for all of those harms.
Mm-hmm. I think you use the words thinking about this holistically and systematically, and I think that very well describes your approach here to the problems. I think it also describes how you think about some of the ways forward. When I think about animal rights and animal agriculture, sort of the first two goals that come to mind are trying to rein in the animal agriculture industry and trying to reduce subsidies, boycotts, bans, etc. Basically reducing support for harmful industries, and then on the flip side of that being tried to build up more positive alternatives. So
Mm-hmm.
pursuing policies and cultural shifts that promote sustainable, healthy, accessible, plant-based food. Um, I think one of the exciting things in your book to me is that you talk about reducing support for harmful industries, increasing support for alternatives, but you also have kind of a more expansive vision of what it would mean to include non-human animals in our political and economic and social structures, affecting everything from infrastructure decisions to education to environmental impact assessments. So yeah, do you want to talk about this aspect of your argument?
Yeah, sure. And I appreciate that you highlight the need to reform our food systems, because that, of course, really is a necessary condition for any other kind of positive change.
Right. I don't want to
And
downplay reducing
yeah,
support
that
for
should not
factory
be
farms,
overlooked.
increasing support for
But I
alternatives.
Right, but I also do think that we have focused on that issue so much in the animal movement, understandably and I think correctly, but in a way that can push to the side all kinds of other ways that we can also be working to reduce the harms that we cause to animals or increase support for them. And so yes, I discuss some options in the book, and some of them are kind of short to medium term things that we can do within existing structures, like, of course, increasing research and advocacy around animals, which is, of course, important, because if we want to have the knowledge and the power and the political will to make any kinds of meaningful big picture changes in the long run, then we really do need to engage in certain types of advocacy and research now, particularly when it comes to especially neglected and vulnerable animals like wild animals and aquatic animals and invertebrates, the sorts of animals we might not think of as much as we think of, charismatic megafauna like elephants and giraffes and so on. So research and advocacy, and then we can include animals in, for example, impact assessments that inform policy decisions. Simply including animal welfare in our impact assessments can remind us that there are stakes for them too in our decisions. And if we do simple things like include their welfare in our impact assessments, or have an animal welfare office or officer in the room when people are making these decisions, then that can sometimes be enough to put it back on the agenda and guide people towards policy decisions that reduce harm across the board, rather than reducing some harm for humans by increasing other harms for humans and other animals unnecessarily. So research advocacy, including animals in impact assessments. And then when you do that, you can find all kinds of low-hanging fruit opportunities to improve things for humans and other animals at the same time. So when you make education and employment policy changes, you can improve the ways that animals are covered in education. And this is something that we can do as educators in our own curricula. Stop harming animals in education, start teaching people more about animal ethics and animal welfare, and how human and non-human environmental health are linked. That would be a really valuable thing for people to learn in general, and especially in medical and veterinary education. And then for employment policy, as we seek just transitions away from harmful energy and transportation systems and towards better alternatives, we can do the same thing for food. So we can be working with farmers and with workers, as some organizations already are, to support them in transitioning away from animal agriculture and towards better alternatives, so that our push towards those alternatives can also be improving situations for vulnerable workers, and we can be pursuing this in a just way. And then with social services and infrastructure, we can increase public support for veterinary services and rescues and sanctuaries, and we can build infrastructure that leads to fewer conflicts between human and non-human animals, and less need in the first place. For instance, when we build future cities in food and energy and transportation systems, we can consider animal welfare, and we can include accommodations for animals in our designs, like overpasses or underpasses or wildlife corridors and new green rail systems, or bird-friendly glass on new buildings or vehicles to reduce collisions with birds, the types of things that hurt humans and other animals at the same time. And I could go on, but I'll close this answer just by noting that then later in the book, I mentioned that there are also things we can do to move beyond existing systems. So not only are there ways we can improve our treatment of animals within existing systems, but we can also question our fundamental social, political, and economic structures themselves. And that is where we can really be making progress for other animals.
Mm-hmm. In a previous interview with Theo Rio-Francos, we briefly talked about how when we transition transportation to greener methods, that maybe just replacing every gas-powered car with an electric car isn't necessarily the best solution, because not only do you have to mine lithium for this, and at the side of the mining, there are often conflicts with indigenous groups, and also mining can be harmful to the non-human animals who live there as well. And sort of if you use more buses and trains and such, that you need fewer total materials. It occurs to me that another reason not to do this is because cars run over lots of non-human animals.
Yes, right.
And
right.
roads, like you mentioned, can be a major disruptor of habitat, of migration corridors. So while
That's exactly right. Yeah.
while we have this moment to do knock on wood, do a huge transition of our political, economic, and social structures, it's, ideally we wouldn't be having to deal with such a rapid threat like climate change, but it can be an opportunity to rebuild in a way that is more conscious of the other animals around us. Even something like bird-friendly glass is something that I hadn't necessarily thought a lot about. And then I read it in your book, and I was like, oh my gosh, why don't we all use bird-friendly glass?
Right. Yeah.
And yeah, in the climate movement, we think about a just transition for fossil fuel workers, and we've certainly seen how trying to get rid of industries like coal, oil, and gas can bring environmentalists into conflict sometimes with workers who are understandably worried about losing their jobs. And I think trying to get a head start on this as well. And you cite in the book a couple programs where either animal rights orgs or whoever are trying to engage preemptively with farm workers and provide pathways to more sustainable, more animal friendly plant farms. Seems like something that is really important to start doing ahead of time, before it kind of becomes a big conflict. But yeah, I do want to jump on the last part of your answer, which is that we can think bigger picture about how can our political and economic and legal systems change to better accommodate non-human animals. Specifically, you talk about legal and political status, or in some cases lack thereof. What would this look like?
Yeah, and to be clear, you can go deeper and deeper and deeper towards the foundations of existing social, political, and economic systems, right? So once you start to question the basic legal and political status and representation of animals, that is a deeper type of change than merely getting some new regulations on the books or changing education or employment policy. But it might still be stopping short of full system change, like replacing liberal capitalist democracies with some other different type of system. But I do think this level is worthy of consideration too. So what I discuss are efforts to change the basic legal and political status of non-human animals, which is basically the status of objects or property or commodities. Right now, for example, in the United States and many other jurisdictions, there are basically two types of fundamental legal status you can have. You can be a person with the capacity for rights that reflect your interests and needs, or you can be a thing or an object without the capacity for any rights at all. And right now, all and only humans, plus certain stand-ins for human interests like corporations, are persons, at least in the United States and many other countries. And non-human animals and everything else in the world are things. So animals are indistinguishable in many ways legally from tables and chairs in that respect. We can protect them as property or as objects of public interest in the same way that we can protect paintings or statues as property or objects of public interest, but we cannot protect them for their own sakes fundamentally under the law unless we pass certain particular laws because we care about particular animals. And so one type of change, of course, would be to either extend legal personhood to all sentient beings and to say that all sentient beings can have legal rights that reflect their basic interests and needs, or we can develop some new kind of fundamental legal status to apply to non-human animals. But the binary between persons and things is not going to work moving forward. And so we either need to extend personhood to animals or create some new kind of status and replace personhood with that status, or combine personhood with that status. And similar remarks can be made about political status. So in addition to being legal persons, we are also citizens of particular political communities. I am a citizen of the United States. And so with legal status comes a basic right to not be harmed or interfered with in various ways. But with political status comes a much broader set of rights within your particular political community. So I have the right to reside here, to return here if I leave, to have my interests represented in the political process, to in various ways participate in the political process. And so once again, animals are left out of this. And once again, we can ask whether animals should be included in this. And of course, Sue Donaldson and Will Kymlicka and other political theorists have covered this ground. But to briefly summarize the issue and their contributions to this literature, they argue that in various ways, our categories of political membership can be extended to non-human animals in appropriate situations. So we can extend citizenship and the appropriate relevant rights of citizenship to various domesticated animals. And we can extend sovereignty, a right to self-government and non-interference, to various wild animal populations. And then we can extend a kind of denizen status, a middle ground status, to various liminal animal populations. And to be clear, this is not to say that non-human animal citizens would have all the same political rights as human citizens. They would once again have those aspects of citizen rights that make sense for them, given their abilities and interests and needs. And so that might include a right to reside and return, a right to have their interests represented, and then maybe or maybe not a right to participate in the political process, depending on how you interpret that right and their abilities and interests. So those are some examples of how we might extend existing categories of legal and political status to non-human animals, or consider replacing them or supplementing them with brand new categories of legal or political status built from the ground up for animals. But one way or the other, they cannot remain objects, property, commodities under the law, and they cannot remain invisible within our political community. So somehow this fundamental status needs to change.
Yeah, you briefly mentioned Will Kymlicka and Sue Donaldson. They're the author of Zoopolis, A Political Theory of Animal Rights. Just if anyone listening is interested in these questions, I highly recommend that book. I think where I have questions about it, nits I would pick, in part related to what you just said, where I'm not sure if our existing conceptions of being a citizen or our existing conceptions of being a sovereign community or nation are I'm not sure whether they totally work for humans, let alone whether we should apply them for non-humans. But but yeah, that book made me think a lot and changed how I approach this entirely. Yeah, I do kind of want to push another enticing hint you dropped, which is around political representation or involvement in the political process. It's funny because in this, this is, I think, episode 9 of this podcast, and the way in is to every episode is we're talking about some, either animal issue or climate issue or other ecological issue. And I think on the majority of episodes, we've made our way at some point or another to talking about what is democracy, what is it for, does democracy, as we have it now with representative voted on institutions work? Are there other ways of doing democracy? And I think partly that's a reflection of my own interests, but also I think it's kind of important to all of these issues, especially if you care about other animals, but even thinking about climate change in general, it's an issue that affects where the actions of people in one location, their actions are going to affect other species, like you mentioned, other nations of humans who aren't part of that political community, future generations who again don't get a vote, and we're just kind of forced to, I think, expand our conception in some way of who, again, who's democracy and for, and what is it for.
Right.
But I was wondering if you did want to maybe talk briefly about some, and I don't know one maybe has
Yeah.
the perfect plan, but what are ways we could involve other animals in the political process?
Yeah, so as with legal and political status, I think we should ask this question from two angles. One being, how could we reform or improve existing approaches to political representation? And the other being, should we consider more radically revising or replacing existing forms of political representation? And so in other words, one version of the question is, how could a more just version of liberalism, democracy, and capitalism function, one that includes animals as subjects rather than merely as objects? And then another one is, should we be maintaining liberalism, democracy, and capitalism in the first place, or should we replace some or all of them with some alternative system? With respect to the first kind of question, how could we make, for example, democracy better by including animals as participants? Obviously animals might not be able to vote in exactly the same way that humans do because these systems use human languages and modes of understanding. We nevertheless can engage non-human agency more as part of the democratic process. We can study their behavior, their revealed preferences, and we can update our views about what they care about, what they want and need, in light of paying more attention to what they are telling us. And then we can find ways to represent their voices as best we can as human agents in democratic systems. And people are working on ways to do that, as you said, with other non-participating stakeholders like children, members of other nations, members of future generations, people whose well-being is impacted by our political decisions, but who might not have the opportunity or the ability to directly participate in our political decisions. And there are all kinds of ways that can be done. There can be, for example, citizens' assemblies, which are bodies of ordinary citizens who are tasked with providing the state with informal advice about how to include this consideration in policy decisions. That would be a sort of less ambitious way to get it on the agenda. And then you can also consider much more radical possibilities like new systems of government. You can imagine two houses of government, where one house of government, the lawmakers are tasked with representing participating stakeholders, and the other house of government is tasked with representing non-participating stakeholders. And then, as with the Senate and the House in the U.S., either one can suggest legislation, but both ultimately have to agree on it and approve it. So that would just be one very radical and ambitious example of how they could be represented in a more fundamental way. And then there are all kinds of more detailed questions to be asked too. And to be clear, none of this is perfect. None of this is ideal. These are all different ways of biased and ignorant human beings taking it upon ourselves to represent the interests and needs of a much more diverse and varied group of stakeholders. But we have to take seriously the reality that is the situation we are stuck in. That we have the responsibility to think about how our actions are going to affect other animals. And so we have to consider our impacts on them and represent their interests as best we can, even though any attempt to do that is obviously ultimately going to fall short in all sorts of ways.
You mentioned citizens' assemblies during that answer, and I think one of the things that is promising to me about these, where sort of randomly selected groups of citizens are assembled to discuss issues like climate change and come up with policy recommendations, is that they often come up with policy recommendations that are more radical or sweeping than that you would get from just taking a public opinion poll without any deliberation or information or educational element, and B, that are certainly more than the elected politicians are often entertaining. And I think one of the things that's promising about that to me is to think about what are ways in which we can introduce town halls or local assemblies or just forums for people to deliberate about issues and talk about them with their neighbors and communities, and come up with ideas that
Yeah.
getting everyday people more involved in the solutions and the political processes, could lead to, at the very least, better results,
Yeah.
than what we're getting now. And there's a
Right.
there's a case in France where Macron, Emmanuel Macron, who had sort of set up the citizen assembly to come up with climate policy recommendations, and he pledged, like, and we'll put your recommendations to a national vote, a ballot referendum, like with no edits. And then they came back with their recommendations, and he was like, well, this is too much. Like, you're asking for too much. I'm actually going to edit it. And there was a whole big fight there in France. But just thinking
Yeah.
about what would be ways to actually give everyday people more power. But also, there's a point at which just giving humans more power and more democracy is going to help other animals, but isn't directly involving them. And I think
Right.
one of the things you mentioned earlier, like, we need better research. Obviously, I would qualify that with research that is, and as I'm sure you would agree with, that is uh, not
Non-invasive and
exploitative or
harmful and
invasive or
lethal, and
confining
yeah.
or deadly
Right.
to the animals involved, but actually just
I do
learning what
indeed
types of
agree.
creatures they are and learning to understand when they are expressing preferences, and what their needs actually are, so that we can find ways to represent that and acknowledge that in our political processes. And like you said, part of what makes that hard is because, democratically including a chimpanzee probably looks different than including a domesticated chicken versus a wild salmon versus a bumblebee.
Yes.
So what when we talk about, okay, animals should count morally, we should include animals in our political, economic, legal systems. Who who are we talking about, and how do we know, and how much?
Yeah. Yeah, this gets into the material towards the very end of the book in
Mhm.
chapters 7 and 8, where I get into some of the really difficult political, but then also scientific and philosophical questions that we need to answer in order to really, in an informed, rational, consistent way, include animals in health and environmental policy. And to be clear, you could skip those chapters if you want to just get some good arguments and initial policy recommendations and work with that. But yeah, if you really want to get into the tough issues, I think these are the ones you have to grapple with. And to answer your question, for me, the question is, which animals are sentient, and how much happiness and suffering can they experience, and what is their capacity for welfare, and other questions like that. Other people might want to answer that question in different ways. In general, you have to ask: Am I going to consider my impacts on every animal, for that matter, every living being, or am I going to consider my impacts on only some animals, like animals who are sentient or agents in some particular kind of way? And then you also have to ask: How much am I going to count the animals I count? Am I going to count them all equally, such that each individual elephant carries the same weight in my decisions as each individual ant? Or am I going to have some way of assigning more weight to some animals than others? But then what would that be, right? And so I just get into some of those questions and show how different answers can lead to very different types of policy recommendations in particular cases. So if you, for example, think all living beings matter, and if you think they all matter equally, then you really do need to be counting every elephant and
Mhm.
every dog and every mouse and every ant and every blade of grass
And
equally.
every human.
Uh, and well, every human as well. Yeah, exactly. We're not above this. We are part of this,
Mhm.
right? But then on the other hand, if you accept instead that only sentient beings matter and they matter in proportion to how much welfare they can have, then you have to start answering these really tricky questions again from your limited and biased and ignorant human perspective, with our bad track record as a species about which animals are
Mhm.
sentient and what is their capacity for welfare, and so on and so forth. So I offer some ways of thinking about how to approach answering these questions, but I also caution people that these are very hard questions to answer, and we do have a bad track record of underestimating animals in our attempts to answer them. and we're going to have to accept that this is an area where we're going to remain uncertain for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, probably if you asked most humans ever, do other animals think and feel pleasure and pain, they'd mostly say yes. But our dominant economic and political and legal and scientific establishment until semi-recently, the last couple hundred years, would have said no, and is only semi-recently starting to acknowledge,
Mm-hmm.
okay, it doesn't make sense to exclude other animals entirely from thinking and feeling. But then, it's impossible to know what anyone else is exactly thinking or feeling. But it feels so much easier to imagine what it's like to be another mammal than it does another insect.
Yeah.
And I think there's also, we don't know, our oysters sentient in some way, our plants sentient in some way, our bacteria, we have guesses to an extent where we can look at their nervous systems and behavior, but I guess what I'm getting at here is that this is hard.
Yes, extremely hard, if not impossible.
And so I don't know. I think one move you make in the book that I found helpful is just like, we don't have to be sure to, I don't know, like if our best neuroscience makes us like 80% sure that honeybee can feel pleasure or pain or whatever, or anxiety or pleasure or whatever, and even if we're not 100% sure, we might want to, at least think about that before
Exactly.
we act.
That is exactly my view. We are not able to know for sure exactly which animals are sentient. I am not able to know for sure that you are sentient. Like, the only mind I can directly access is my own. For all I know, the rest of the world is an incredibly realistic matrix-like simulation full of algorithms that act as though they can think and feel, but actually nothing is going on inside, right? So even with other humans, I have to make some kind of inference based on evidence about your behavior and physiology and our shared history. And I might think the chances are very good that you are sentient, and I should proceed on the assumption that you are, rather than torturing you for fun. But I ultimately do have to maintain some element of doubt if I want to be intellectually serious about these things. And this is no different with other animals. The only difference is the evidence and the probabilities. So as with humans, we can look at things like behavior and physiology and evolutionary history in order to construct estimates about how likely other animals are to be sentient, as far as we can tell. And again, we have to be cautious and humble about this, because our track record is bad, and we can very easily just apply human frameworks to them and not appreciate that there could be other very non-human ways of realizing sentience that are radically different from the ways that we realize sentience. But that is fundamentally what we have to do. We have no choice but to do is look at all the evidence as best we can, as cautiously and humbly as possible, and then assign probabilities to the idea that different animals are sentient. So we might think that with all other vertebrates, chances are very good, like 80% or higher, that they are able to experience pleasure and pain. And with complex invertebrates like octopuses, chances are once again fairly high, maybe like 60-70%, that these animals are sentient. And then with other invertebrates like arthropods, maybe the odds are lower, but still significant, like 20-40%, that insects, for instance, are sentient, and so on down the road. And you might think, well, that might not establish much. Like, if an ant is only 20-40% likely to be sentient, as far as we can tell, that means odds are that they are non-sentient. But that would not mean that we are permitted to do whatever we want to them, right? Like, if I told you, if you drink and drive, you have a 20-40% chance of running someone over and killing them, would you react by saying, oh, well, then more likely than not, I'll get home fine, so no problem, I'll drive drunk? No, you would say, wow, 20-40% is a pretty high chance that I will harm someone for no good reason, so I should call an Uber, right? I should find some other way to get home that doesn't involve imposing a 20-40% risk on somebody, right? And this is no different from that. The only difference is that in the drunk driving case, you have a 20-40% chance of harming someone that you know to be sentient, Whereas in the like insect farming case, you have a 100% chance of harming someone who's 20 to 40% likely to be sentient. Either way, it's a 20 to 40% risk that if you can manage to avoid imposing that risk on someone, you should avoid imposing that risk on someone. So we don't need to achieve certainty about other minds. As long as we look at the evidence as best we can and come up with good estimates and good probabilities, we can use those to inform our decision making. And that will lead to a precautionary stance about harming animals ranging from mammals all the way to insects for no good reason.
Mm-hmm. And when we talk about factory farms and fur farming and the wildlife trade, we're often talking about mammals or birds or other animals who, like you said, we find it easier to relate to, find it easier to see as a sentient being. You raise in the book that there just are so many insects, and there's something in philosophy, and jump in if I get any of this wrong, but there's something in philosophy called the repugnant conclusion,
right?
Which is basically if you're concerned about total happiness, which not all philosophers are, but if you are concerned about sort of the total happiness in the world, you get to a point where you would say that you prefer trillions and trillions of humans living only minimally pleasant lives compared to, say, a few billion who really flourish and feel fulfilled and have wonderful lives. And regardless of what you think of that, you want us to consider what you call creatively the repugnant conclusion with a B.
Never pass up a good opportunity for a pun, even when talking about serious world-ending philosophy issues.
Mm-hmm. So, which I'll briefly summarize, and then you can jump off. That analogously, we might prefer to keep, policies or actions that allow trillions and trillions of insects to be minimally happy or possibly happy in whatever way an insect is happy, compared to a relative handful of happy and fulfilled chimpanzees or whales or elephants or even humans. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is a famous example from the philosopher Derek Parfit in his book Reasons and Persons, and this is an example concerning what philosophers call creation ethics or population ethics. So these are decisions about whether and when and how to bring new beings or new populations into existence, and this matters in discussions about things like pandemics and climate change, because the decisions that we make right now are not only impacting humans and non-humans who already exist, but are also shaping which humans and non-humans will come into existence in the future, right? And one impact of climate change is going to be that some species will go extinct or their numbers will shrink, but other species might come into existence, and so their numbers will increase. And so if you think that it ethically matters who you bring into existence and what kinds of lives they can have, like who you cause or allow to come into existence and how good or bad their lives can be, then you have to think about what are the population level effects down the road of these policies going to be. For example, is climate change going to kill a bunch of large animals like elephants, but then significantly expand the populations of really small animals like insects? Is that a possible consequence of climate change? And if it is, you need to really consider all of those impacts and weigh them against each other. And so, yeah, the repugnant conclusion and what I call the repugnant conclusion just notes that some of these trade-offs can seem unacceptable to us intuitively, even if they would in fact increase aggregate happiness. So for example, if instead of 100 happy elephants, you had 1 million or 1 billion or 1 trillion happy ants, intuitively, as large animals ourselves, we might think, the future with a small number of happy large animals is better than a world with a large number of happy small animals. But you really have to ask, is that true? Is that really the better world? Or might it just be a failure of our imagination and empathy, our ability to picture very large numbers of happy ants and how good their lives could be when you add it all up? And again, as with these questions about well-being and sentience and so on, I don't try to answer these questions in the book. I just present the problems and some different possible solutions to them and how they might lead to different policy decisions in an effort to show that it really is hard, and it requires us to answer these hard scientific and philosophical questions that have really puzzled philosophers now for generations, like these population ethics questions. In order to figure out if climate change is good or bad, you have to figure out which populations will it increase, which populations will it decrease, and then what does that mean for the total number of lives that will exist and the average quality of life of these lives, and then what kind of value do you assign to that outcome, and how does that then reflect back on the rightness or wrongness of our actions and policies? We have to consider that, or else we're probably going to be neglecting the most significant impacts of our climate policies.
Mm-hmm. And I think what was interesting in the book, and we don't have to get into this, is sometimes I would think in my head like, oh, well, I can get around that because maybe I don't care about total happiness. I care about average happiness, and elephants are happier on average. But then, that can also lead to absurd conclusions taken to their extreme.
Exactly.
And so I think if you're interested in some of these finer philosophical points, the book Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves will give you a lot to think about. And if you're not, I think much of the book is written from what I think is a relatively safe assumption that on net, climate change and mass extinction and pandemics are harmful.
Right. So a fine line I had to walk in the book between asking all these harder questions, but then not losing, the crisis in the course of asking all those further questions.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything else you want to add on any of this? We've covered some ground.
I appreciate talking about this with you. This is obviously really interesting and important stuff, and I'm glad to have the opportunity to discuss it on this podcast. So thank you for taking the time to do that.
Cool. Thank you for coming on the podcast and taking the time yourself. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing on Patreon, or signing up for the free newsletter to get a weekly email with each new episode in your inbox. Or just send this episode to a friend or family member who you think might be interested. Have a good day.